The early 90s, a golden era for video gaming that saw titans with the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo go head to head in the console wars to see which would be the best for players to invest in. During this time, many iconic and interesting games would see release on these consoles. Nintendo would have the edge originally due to the overwhelming success of the 8-bit NES console from the previous era, and looked set to dominate the market once again. But things did change drastically, which would see the Mega Drive, or Genesis in America, able to compete and hold its own in sales, both in America and in Europe, which would see many consoles often being bundled with a large collection of games with Sonic the Hedgehog, and equally with the Mega Games 1 collection, one of the first in a series of carts to come up with 3 games from Sega's ever-growing games library, mainly consisting of games that had already saw a release on the console. It would prove to be a popular choice among consumers looking to expand their gaming collections, which would greatly aid in more consoles being sold over its lifespan. We are going to take a look at these games that started off the original series, and how they would set the stage for more compilations to follow in the future, giving players choices ranging from racing to puzzle and sports, ensuring an experience for every variety of player. Columns is an early puzzle game that was released all the way back on the Mega Drive in 1989 and would be among some of the earliest games released on the system. It requires you to match up to a minimum of 3 similarly styled blocks or diamonds in order to create chain effects in order to earn more points, with the difficulty increasing as your skill improves and the further into the game that you get. Now, the overall representation of the game is quite simple, and it won't take long for you to figure out what exactly it is that you need to do. So the columns themselves are literally fallen blocks, and you can use the buttons on the controller to change the orientation of which colour is going to precede itself, whether to start at the bottom, middle or top. So essentially you have to match up the colours that are there with the other colours that are already on the screen from other blocks that have already fallen, and if you can match a minimum of 3 in a row, you'll make them disappear, which will gain you more points. But you also have the possibility of stacking those colours together, even up to 4, 5, even 6, even more, or even multiple combinations of different blocks to disappear, depending on how many blocks are on the screen. There is a level of skill involved, but there is also a lot of luck that can come from what you do, and that will become more apparent the further into the game you get, because it does become more difficult as the speed of the gameplay greatly increases, which requires a lot more flexibility on your part in order to change the colours a lot faster, which isn't the easiest thing to do, in all fairness. But if you like games where you're trying to compete for the highest scores, then this is one of those games that will give you a challenge. And the funny thing is, these games, even way back in those early days, even today, when you see with more modern, even like mobile games and so forth, you can clearly see the inspiration of where modern games come from, because they do have a similar play style to the likes of these older games, because they're very, very addictive. While they may not have been popular with everybody, but they were popular with a vast majority of players overall, and especially the game did get fairly decent reviews across all systems that it released on, originally in the arcade, later on the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, and then would later be ported to the Sega Master System. And it proves that puzzle games were generally a lot more popular than many may have thought. Plus you also have access to a 2-player mode, so you can play head to head against your mates, which also added to the value of the experience also, so you could really compete to see who was the best. It's funny, even when I look back, my first experience with this was again on the Mega Games 1 collection, and having played games on the Master System, I always was more interested in action orientated games or racing games, as they're among my favourite genres. Puzzle games weren't really as such, and I remember seeing this game for the first time and I didn't really understand what it was, nor was I really interested in particular for a long period of time. But it's funny, when I did allow myself to sit down and play it, and allowed myself to get into it, I couldn't believe how addictive it was, even to a point that my dad, when we had the game on the Master System, originally as part of the Master Games 1 collection that we got when we bought our Master System way back in the early 90s, and he played that as much as we did, and even through that, I started playing it even more so as well, because of that, and I found it to be a lot better than I originally thought. I think it's one of those things that you have to look at it with an open mind. Not all gamers will have the same perception of the games that they enjoy, but there are games like this here that are way better than many would think if you just give it a chance, and this is one of those games. Now, it's not for everybody, but it definitely will appeal to some, and for those that have played it in the past, you'll know what I'm talking about, because I can guarantee you've put a lot of hours into this game, and you also have some of the highest scores possible if you remember them. Even recording the footage for this video, it's very easy to get addicted to the game, let's just put it that way. Once you start seeing things stack up and you see the score rolling up, it's very hard to just just stop playing. That's how it draws you in. So I can see why it was a worthwhile title to be added to this collection, as it definitely had those addicting qualities. World Cup Italia 90, one of the greatest spectacles in the history of the World Cup competition, and would also see the little country of Ireland, where I'm from, being put on the map in terms of success regarding world football, as we did really well in that tournament, only for Italy essentially beating us. But let's just say, looking back, I think we were good enough to go all the way, but it just wasn't to be. But regardless, this era would see the release of many different types of games on a variety of consoles, with a soccer game based off of the World Cup Italia 90 tournament being released on the Mega Drive in 1990, and would also see a later release on the Sega Master System in 1991 that would allow you to play as all of the teams that had qualified for the tournament itself, each giving you a chance to go all the way to win the World Cup. And I'm sure many of you growing up like myself would have been introduced to this game mainly through the Mega Games 1 collection, even though it was released on its own previously before it was added to this collection. But it's definitely better known as being part of it rather than on its own in most regards, which sees you playing as your favourite team, and the game plays from a top-down viewpoint, and literally your goal is just typically to play football, where you have to win the ball, you have to cross the ball, pass, shoot, and try and score goals in order to win games. Now, it's no easy task. I remember myself even back in the day trying to play this. A mate of mine had originally gotten the game as part of that collection as well, and we tried to play, and yeah, it took a long time to get familiar with the controls, as when you're playing it for the first few times, it is very difficult to understand really what to do, what buttons do what input, and the fact is that it is very hard to dribble the ball around players, because if an opposing player is anywhere near you, they will take the ball off you instantly, but yet you can do the same if you know what you're doing, which will force you to implement lots of sliding tackles and taking players out of it in order just to win the ball. But when you get familiar with it, you'll definitely score goals and you will have a lot of fun. And honestly, for the time, right, it's not the best soccer game on the system, but what it presented, it had great multiplayer elements, and in most cases definitely was one of its best features in all regards, especially if you were playing with a group of your mates, where you could each take turns trying to beat each other. And with the teams in question, you had multiple different countries that were available. They were all very popular, that also produced some of the greatest players the world had ever seen during that point. Now, the game itself didn't get the best of reviews overall, again because of the issues that I mentioned, with it being a very tough game overall, and with it not selling great overall on the Mega Drive. This game allowed for more copies to be sold, with it being part of the collection, so it would have introduced players to the game initially that would never have heard of it before. But in saying that, with these three games, both World Cup Italia 90, Super Hang-On and Columns, they all presented different challenges and different ways to play games, as there was a different style of game there for each type of player. But having access to an additional 3 games upon buying the Mega Drive for the first time, this would also aid in being able to produce and sell more consoles, but would also add more variety for players. Now, it's really just down to the person. Some people would like these games, others maybe not so much, but they did help to set the stage for future collections. But again, not the best soccer game that was seen on the system, but it holds its place as being part of this collection, which also did help sell a lot of consoles. So in many ways, it stands up to the test of time in that respect. The classic arcade motorbike racing game, Super Hang-On, would be added to the Mega Games 1 collection that originally started off life in the arcades way back in 1987 and would become one of Sega's most popular arcade games of all time. So the Mega Drive would receive a port of the arcade edition, although there were certain elements that were scaled back obviously to make it run on the console more efficiently. And if you are looking for the perfect arcade port, unfortunately you won't get that with this edition, but it's still a good solid experience for what it does represent. But it also gives additional elements with an original mode that wasn't available in the arcade version that sees you literally leveling up from scratch, where you start off with a baseline bike and then you have to earn money by competing in races which you can then use to upgrade your bike. But at the same time you can also take damage, so if you crash your bike or if you get into some sort of accident, you can damage certain elements which will cost money then to fix it at the end of the race, or to a point that if you have a really bad crash that you can literally wipe the bike out altogether, which in turn will be game over, so you'll have to continue from the last race that you saved on, which will use a password system in order to continue on your save point, and you'll just have to rinse and repeat the experience again until you've pretty much leveled up your bike now, which will take a while because some of the elements, especially later on, require large sums of money to buy the highest spec elements for your bike so that it can compete at the highest level, which will require a lot of grinding and just race after race in order to achieve, and that won't appeal to some players, especially if you don't have a lot of patience to play these type of games for a long time. But if you do want something quick and fast to play in short bursts, then you can definitely play the arcade mode, which will allow you to play through races based on different continents, each with varying levels of stages that start from beginner to medium and advanced. That will definitely test your skill and nerve. Now for those that have played and that are well adaptable to these games, you shouldn't have a problem, but for the rest of us that are more casual players, this game is tough. And I remember that even way back when I first played it. Funnily enough, when I played Super Hang-On the Mega Games 1 collection, it would be the first game on that collection that I actually played. And for me it kind of goes like full circle, because even looking back, when I first played the Master System, which would be the first proper games console that I ever played, the first game I played on the Sega Master System would be Hang-On as well, which I also enjoyed. So I definitely really like this version, although again it was equally as tough as the Master System one. This port of the game wasn't the only port to be seen, as it did get a release on a multitude of other gaming systems of the time, even from like lesser powered systems with the ZX Spectrum, even as far back as the Amstrad CPC, the Amiga, Atari ST, and then even say with the Master System. But then the Mega Drive at the time would have been closer to the arcade original compared to every other version that was out there. But it did have great graphics, great sound effects, and also give you access to some memorable music tracks that definitely left a lasting impression on many gamers growing up, because as soon as you hear those tunes it will instantly remind you of the game. It's still fun to play even now. Even looking back, many of these games were later ported or even added to modern systems way back over the last number of years, even with the PS3. Plus additional ports were also added onto other consoles, even handheld systems, over the last 20 so years. And I have covered one of those ports in a previous video, which I will link here on screen and in the description, which would see Super Hang-On also being added to another collection for the Game Boy Advance. It's still a fun game to play, even in short bursts. From time to time, whenever I go back to play a lot of these older games, there's a very good chance I'll always turn on Hang-On and just give it a go, even for a quick 10-15 minutes. There's just something about it that always brings you back, as it does provide great memories of your childhood, and it was one of the first games I ever played originally on the Sega Mega Drive. And I think for many of us, most of our experiences growing up would literally have been from those three games, because even for me, I never had my first games console till I was at the age of 10, so the only other access that you had, or the ability to play games, was either through friends at school that had a console, so you'd go round to their house to play it. And more often than not, the majority of them that had a Sega Mega Drive usually had the Mega Games 1 collection, and that's where you would usually spend most of your time playing. You'd either be playing Hang-On or you'd be playing World Cup Italia 90, you'd be trying to play competitively against each other. Mind you, it never went well, but still it was good fun. Columns at the time wasn't always my thing, but as years went on, I gradually got into it a lot more and I found it to be very addictive, and it is a really good solid game. But there's definitely something there for everybody, in all fairness to it. Each of the 3 games presented in this collection provided players with a variety of interesting choices, mixing gameplay from puzzle solving to sports and adrenaline-fueled arcade racing that would set the stage for future collections in the series on the Mega Drive and other Sega consoles. The choices available provided something for every type of player that would also prove to be popular games in their own right, even so far as helping to sell more consoles over the Mega Drive's lifespan, usually being packaged as part of a bundle collection, especially during the 90s, often seen being included alongside Sonic the Hedgehog, giving players tons of variety, paving the way for more collections to follow, which this next video will provide, as we will look at the collection that many consider to be the greatest entry in this iconic game series.